Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Rife.
On today's episode, we're launching a new feature called the Blindspot Challenge. That's where Katie and I challenge each other to catch up with a major movie the other hasn't seen. Because it's almost Halloween, we'll be talking about two classics of the horror genre, The Omen and Eyes Without a Face.
Welcome to Film Club.
Okay, Katie, so it's October and the spooky month, as they say. This month we on the podcast we are exclusively talking about horror movies, about scary films. And last week we talked about elevated horror, that whole concept. And really dug into that. And this week we're trying something new, something that you and I have talked about launching for a few weeks now. Just a new kind of feature idea that we've been interested in doing, and it's called the Blindspot Challenge. And I think I mentioned the basic premise up front, but I'll say again that the basic idea of this is that each of us basically come to the table with a classic movie that we have not seen and that the other person has seen, and we talk about them. And I feel like you had a little bit of reluctance with this one at first. Is that right?
Yeah, when you first brought this one up, I was like, oh, I don't know if I should be admitting what I haven't seen on tape. Especially with horror movies, I think it was a little bit of something where I was kind of like, I'm not going to be so dramatic as to call it PTSD, but I flashed back to a horror convention 10 years ago, when some dude was like, oh yeah, well, name the director of photography and 3 of the stars. And you're just like, yeah, there is horror, I think, because of the subcultural identity that we were talking about last week when we were talking about elevated horror. Gatekeeping is another topic that comes up a lot when it comes to horror. And, basically I was a little hesitant because I will say I'm getting off topic here, but I will say that the gatekeeping isn't as intense as it used to be 15 years ago, when I was college age, but it definitely has put this sort of fear in me to where I'm like, oh, I can't admit what I haven't seen. I don't want to talk about that I haven't seen this big movie because it's like admitting weakness, kind of.
Well, but so let me ask you this, though. How much of that is the culture changing and how much of that is you just seeing more things and feeling more confident in your general knowledge about movies?
Well, I think it's probably 50-50 because it's definitely gatekeeping is a topic that I have sort of noticed a cultural shift around it. It went from being well, of course you have your movie that you ask if someone's seen it as a way to kind of challenge them and test their bona fides. And that's sort of part of my crudity, but sort of dick measuring contest. I think there has been some sort of shift away from that in the larger horror culture, but also, yes, I have also had 15 years to see a lot more movies, and so I am a lot more confident in my skills, and also I've just sort of matured as a person. I think you care less about things some random nerd thinking you're a poser as you get older.
Well, I think it is relevant in our line of work. Knowledge base, honestly. And what it comes down to is that if you're going to be writing about movies for a living, you should know a thing or two about them, certainly. I think that critics on a whole want to project an authority. That's right. One of the reasons that people read criticism is they want to read something from somebody who, it's not just about opinions. It's not just about, oh, this person has a sensibility that I relate to. It's that you're coming to people who you hope have some sort of larger knowledge of the medium and a sense of history. I mean, I think some of the great critics are ones that have a really strong sense of the history of the medium and where it's been.
Yeah, I agree.
And points of reference. Because something something that I even recognized about myself early on is that I did not have enough points of reference at a certain point. So it's not just about recognizing when a movie is walking in another film's footsteps. It's sometimes about being able to acknowledge genuine innovation and also being able to acknowledge the lineage that something is working in,
Yeah, the lineage thing is really important, I think, and kind of knowing like the different signposts along the way. And incidentally, I think this is one of the things that's great about film criticism is that you don't necessarily have to go to college for it to be good at it, because you can just sit and watch a ton of movies and learn that way.
Very true. I mean, I think that's the best education you can get if you're interested in being a film critic. I always say this when people ask my advice. I always say, well, one of the things is that you should just watch a lot of movies. And you should read a lot about movies as well, you know? I mean, you should, because the thing is, here's the other thing about it. I mean, all of us have a certain knowledge base, and all of us, nobody has seen everything, is the truth. I mean,
right.
The former co-host of the show, Ignatiy Vishnevetsky, regular critic for the AV Club, that man is a walking encyclopedia. And he has seen a lot of films, and he, I can pretty much always count on him to know about a film when I bring it up with him. But the other thing is that I think Ignatiy, and he might not admit this himself, but I do think that Ignatiy also has this crucial skill that we have to have as film critics, which is the ability to bullshit sometimes too. I mean, really, because the truth is that there are movies that you and I have not seen. Important movies, that you and I have not seen. Sometimes, but I guarantee that with some of them, we know enough about them that we could have a conversation at a cocktail party about them,
Right.
Like,
yeah. And also different people have different areas of expertise, I think maybe for me, I'm a little more sensitive about horror because I do consider it an area of expertise. But I didn't grow up with it. I wasn't allowed to watch horror movies when I was a kid. And so I feel perpetually behind a lot of the people who grew up immersed in the genre.
That's the thing. I mean, I think one of the reasons a lot of people get into criticism is that they spend a lot of their life watching movies. But you do sort of, one of the advantages of watching movies all your life is that you sort of get a head start on that. Regardless of what genre it is, So yeah, I mean, I think what it comes down to is that I don't think there should be a lot of shame about things you haven't seen. We're all going to have these blind spots that I'm talking about. Even professional film critics have movies that they have not gotten around to see. I mean, I heard, I can't remember who said this. There's this famous quote that somebody once said that the more you learn about something, the more you realize that you don't know anything about it. That's one of those like corny aphorisms that you eventually realize is true. Is that the wise man is the man who knows he knows nothing. Totally. Yep. So I think that it's good to acknowledge that we all haven't seen anything, but I will say that I also am sympathetic to the general, I would say, habit among film critics and cinephiles of hiding their blind spots, of not coming forward and saying this is a movie I haven't seen, because we all have them, and I mean, I think we all probably have ones that we're a little embarrassed about, and I do think that as a critic, I don't think it's wrong to necessarily disguise those if you can still understand what some of these films, where they fit into the history of the medium and what their importance is. I would also say that if you are aware that you have this blind spot and you are embarrassed by it as a critic, I think that's a pretty good indication that maybe you should catch up with it if you can. Yeah, that's fair. Like I was saying before, you don't have to go out and get a degree to fill in a blind spot. You can just rent a movie. Yep. So, yeah, I will say that if there are Letterboxd users out there, you don't have to make every one of your lists public. You can have private ones. And I will say from personal experience that it is nice to have a list of films that I know I should have seen by now, that I can consult. And anytime somebody brings something up that I realize, shit, I should have seen that by now as a critic, I will add it. I will add it to that list. I am not going to make that list public. That is my business. I think that's okay. Yeah. I think that's okay. Yeah. But I do think in the interest of transparency, we wanted to launch this feature because it's just a fun way, I think, to talk about some classics that one of us hasn't necessarily seen. I proposed before we were doing this Halloween series, I proposed doing a week where we would launch the series. We ended up going some other idea, but I was like, I have an enormous blind spot, and that is Patrick Swayze. Now, obviously, most of his films I don't think qualify as they're not like Criterion fare necessarily. Yeah.
I was going to say the Swayze films as a blind spot, no offense, but it's a little bit of a softball because they're not part of the canon. The films that you're most supposed to be embarrassed about are ones that are like AFI top 10 and you've never seen it.
Fair enough, but they are, I mean, these are big cultural events. Now, so I'm going to say I have not seen Roadhouse, I have not seen Dirty Dancing, and I have not seen Ghost.
Well, yeah, you didn't go to sleepovers with elementary school girls in the 90s, like, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you're right that I'm not admitting to some huge classic of cinema that I have not seen, but I do think that
maybe you don't have one, man.
Oh, yes, I do. I guarantee I do. But today we're going to be talking about both of us are horror fans in general, and I think both of us have a pretty, probably a pretty large knowledge base. And if you and I were to list out every horror movie we've ever seen, if that were even possible, I think they would both be very long lists.
Yeah. Speaking of Letterboxd, when you mentioned having the private list of things you haven't seen, there's a certain tendency on that site to want to log every movie you've ever seen as sort of this way to prove that you have seen it. But I just don't have the follow through. I don't have the time for something like that.
Yeah. I love Letterboxd, but I told myself when I got a Letterboxd account, I was kind of a holdout for a little while. And I told myself, for those who don't know, the listeners who don't know, Letterboxd is a social media site that allows you to log and rate movies you've seen. It's intense. I think it's very, very useful as a film diary in some respects. I mean, a lot of people, cinephiles will often historically have kept notebooks of all the movies you've watched and when. It's very useful in that respect because it completely digitizes all that. You can mark when you saw it. You can mark if you've seen it before. Very useful. But I'll say that when I got the account, I made a promise to myself that I was not going to turn it into an extension of my profession. Now, kind of done that, honestly. But I will say that I do not religiously log everything. I will miss something sometimes, and I don't treat that like a big deal because honestly, if I tried to go through and log and rate, and it's great for people who are obsessive about this kind of thing and who want a record of everything they've ever seen and want a record of how they felt about it. But I do not have the bandwidth, one might say, to treat Letterboxd.
That's a good way to put it.
Do not treat it as this is a place where you can go and see my opinion on every single movie I've ever seen. Not going to do it.
Yeah, and in that way, it does turn into sort of a very quiet, passive-aggressive, almost bragging rights kind of tool if you do that. Yeah. But I just don't think it's quite worth it for all that time.
Also, leave some mystery.
Yeah, there you go.
What does Katie think about Citizen Kane? Leave some mystery.
I'm the one person that hates it. That's me.
So we're in the middle of October, and we're devoting this whole month of Film Club to Halloween-related fare, to horror movies. Today we are going to talk about two horror films, one could say classics of the genre that one of us has not seen. So I guess we just list the films. For me, the film is Eyes Without a Face.
Yep.
Classic French horror movie that I know very much by reputation, but until a couple days ago I had never seen. For you, it is The Omen. That's Richard Donner's Child of Satan movie from the 1970s.
Also a movie I know by reputation, a movie I'd seen scenes from, but I had never sat down and watched all the way through.
Yes, and I will be very curious as we talk about this, the degree to which either of us felt like we were seeing things that were already sort of ingrained in our pop culture consciousness through cultural osmosis,
both of these are hugely influential films. Yeah.
So let's start with Eyes Without a Face.
Yeah. So when you think about horror, you don't necessarily think about France in the late 1950s when you think about transgressive horror movies, but it was actually a hotbed for it at the time. And so in the mid-50s, there was a series of lurid English Gothic thrillers starring Peter Cushing that had done very well in France. And that kind of kicked off a sort of, not even a renaissance, but horror, like they had Ciné-Fantastique, which is more of a fantasy sci-fi thing, had been in French cinema from the beginning. But horror films were still kind of thought of as taboo or low class around this time in France. And so you had Diabolique, which is another classic, which came out around that same time. And then, of course, you had Eyes Without a Face. And Eyes Without a Face does have quite a bit of a pedigree. The team who wrote it, they wrote a novel called From Among the Dead that formed the basis for Vertigo. And the cinematographer had also shot films for Fritz Lang and G.W. Pabst and all these great silent expressionist masters. But Eyes Without a Face at the time was kind of received the same way in 1960 when it came out in France as a sort of like Friday the 13th film was received in the U.S. in the 80s.
Oh, interesting.
People were, it was like Cahiers du Cinéma wrote a review of it in which they tried to characterize the film as horror noir, like they tried to lump it in with film noir because they just couldn't reconcile a director like the director of this film, Georges Franju, that he would make a horror film, something so disrespectable and lurid as a horror film. And in the US, it was released like a regular B horror thriller. It was retitled The Horror Chamber of Dr. Faustus and dubbed into English. But interestingly, for the US release, they took out the most graphic scene in the film, which is a very graphic surgery scene midway through the film where you see a woman's face being cut off with a scalpel and then lifted up, and then you see the bloody flesh underneath.
Can I say that? Can I say real quick that scene? Just to jump in for a second, that that's one of the many things about this movie that I knew about in advance going into it, and I was genuinely shocked at how gory it is for a film from 1959. It's
very gory for the time, very gory. When it came out, there was a screening in Glasgow at a film festival, and I don't know if this is the beginning of it, but this is still something you see a lot in Ballyhoo, where 7 people fainted at a screening in Glasgow, and this was like a selling point for the film, that it was so shocking and so grisly and so lurid. And the director, once again, his name's Georges Franju. He had made a documentary in the late 40s called The Blood of Beasts, which was scenes from a slaughterhouse cut in with scenes from the French suburbs. And of course, And so this is very popular with the cinema intelligentsia. And so they were a little taken aback that this director would make something so pulpy and, lowbrow. But the film, it has a through line with that, right? It's a classic mad scientist movie about an arrogant plastic surgeon. He's played by Pierre Brasseur. And so the plot is that he disfigures his daughter, whose name is Christiane. She's played by Edith Scobb. Please forgive me if you speak French well. I'm sorry. And so he disfigures her in a car accident. And so, the mechanics of it aren't very well explained. It's a fairy tale. You don't have to explain it. But for some reason, her face was totally ripped off in the car accident. And so they keep murdering these other women and trying to graft their face onto her face, which leads to there's a pretty gross montage in this film, actually, where they have still photos of effects makeup of the necrosis of the face rejecting the transplant, which is pretty gross.
Yeah, I was surprised by that too. I thought that was pretty gross as well.
It is.
Yeah.
And so it was received at the time with shock and like a splatter film. But it's interesting over time this film's critical reputation has come back around. And now when you hear critics or filmmakers talk about it, they talk a lot about how lyrical and poetic and haunting it is, which is really interesting. And but, you know, its sort of high-low reputation continues because there's a Pedro Almodovar film called The Skin I Live In, which has a very similar plot to Eyes Without a Face. He puts some Almodovar melodramatic twists and turns on top of it, but the basic concept is similar. And there's also a Billy Idol song called Eyes Without a Face that was on the Rebel Yell album. So this film has had, you know, a long influence. It's very, very influential, I think, in the way it uses the animal symbolism and the family dynamics and the way that it's shot have all been super influential. Like, was there anything that came up, you know, that you noticed, Dowd, that it evoked for you?
Well, here's the thing. So again, this is a movie that has always been sort of on my watch list for a very long time, and whose reputation has always been something, well, I wouldn't say always, but has been something I've been aware of since I got heavily into horror, into cinema as a teenager, you know? So I've seen, there have been moments in films where I've been like, oh, I think this is supposed to be a reference to that film. You know, I mean, people talk about like Batman, for example. Tim Burton's Batman has a little bit in there that is clearly evoking this a little bit. We discussed this earlier, I think when we were talking about setting up this series, but that John Carpenter was influenced. So Edith Scobb's character wears this mask, this sort of white expressionless mask. To cover her disfigured face.
Porcelain mask, yeah.
Yes, it's porcelain mask. It's very creepy because it's very like Uncanny Valley. It actually looks kind of close to a real face, but it's completely expressionless. And John Carpenter has cited that as an influence on the Michael Myers mask in Halloween.
Yep.
Which I believe.
Yeah, which is similar.
Yeah, it is very much so. It looks very similar, and it's although that mask is, if I'm not mistaken, is a William Shatner Star Trek mask painted white, right?
Spray painted white. Yeah, that's right. What it is. Yeah.
Yep. So
he might have, in retrospect, been like, "Eyes Without a Face." Yeah, totally. That's what I was doing.
Yeah. I definitely wouldn't put that past Carpenter.
No, and
he's like, yeah, sure, whatever. He's like, when do I get paid?
Yeah, right. If those listening don't know, John Carpenter is kind of notorious for kind of being like, yeah, whatever. Like, he doesn't like to talk about his old movies. He just likes to talk about video games and basketball.
Can I say, I love when they ask John Carpenter how he feels about an upcoming remake. And his answer is always the same. It's some variation on, am I being paid for it? Then I'm fine with it.
Yeah, then I love it.
Like, he does not give a fuck. I know this is a side note. I love John Carpenter. I love his movies. And I've always loved how cantankerous he was. I think I assumed for a long time that was kind of a thing that happened as he got older, because some filmmakers, when they get older, turn into cranky old men.
Sure.
Carpenter has been a grump since early in his career. Yeah. People have asked him before if he likes making movies, and he said before, and this could just be, I mean, directors like to bullshit sometimes, but Carpenter has basically said before, no, I mean, I don't really enjoy it. It's a job, you know?
Yeah.
Which I have to assume there's a little bit of bullshit in that because he's so good at it, you know?
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's a job that's really competitive to get. And so, like, unless you're somebody's child, you don't really stumble into being a film director. You have to try to become a film director.
Totally. Yeah. There's this amazing roundtable discussion with him, David Cronenberg, and I think Joe Dante is the third one in the group. It's on the Criterion DVD of Videodrome. And it's the three of them just talking about horror. And it's from, like, the early 80s, and, you know, when Carpenter was, you know, kind of on top of the world, I guess, as much as on top of the world as Carpenter ever has been. And he just comes across as a grump even then, you know? So I love it. Anyway.
So Eyes Without a Face,
yep.
This sort of combination of like poetic and lyrical and dreamlike. And I think the filmmaking is very efficient in its way. You know, it's spare, I think would be a better word than efficient.
Yeah.
And that combination of that and, for the time, very extreme gore. And even now you're like, oh, wow, that was that was pretty graphic. I think that combination, it reminded me of last week when we were talking about elevated horror.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I mean, this is definitely a film that I think has one foot planted in horror and one foot planted in art. Or maybe in the art house, one might say. I mean, I don't think the French were wrong to. I think they were onto something when they said this thing is kind of describing it as noir horror. I think is actually pretty accurate. I think this has a lot of qualities of noir, down to the kind of tortured psychology of the characters, to the way that he shoots it. I mean, there's a lot of shadows in this film. There is a sequence, or it's really, honestly, it's really the opening sequence of the film where the mad doctor's assistant is driving, and she's basically going to get rid of the body of one of the women that they've kidnapped, and the sequence has a kind of noirish Hitchcockian quality to it, where we're kind of seeing her look in the rearview mirror, and there's a little bit of the Marion Crane suspense of the early scenes of Psycho, which this obviously predates by about a year, actually. Side note: 1959, 1960 is a real turning point for cinema in general, and I think it's also a turning point for horror. I think there's I agree. A lot of sort of vital art horror films hit in that very window, Yeah,
I agree. Like, we talked about it on an episode a few months ago, but one of my sort of favorite movie facts is that time ticketing really originates with Psycho.
Yep, that's right.
Which was also 1960.
Yep. So, yeah, I mean, I think I see a lot of, someone could probably answer if there's a film that happened before this that influenced this movement as well. But one of the genres of horror that gets under my skin a little bit is medical horror. And I see a little bit of that, the origins of that in this, because the famous sequence that we're talking about when he takes this woman's face off is so clinical. And, it is. It's so creepy and so long. Like, it's a long sequence of him meticulously cutting this woman's face off, Yeah.
And there's a part where they stick the scalpel under the chin and it jiggles a little bit. And
It genuinely got under my skin a little bit,
so to speak.
Yeah. And the special effects aren't state of the art by any means, but they're effective enough. I mean, my general feeling about special effects, especially in horror movies, is that if it can create your desire to suspend your disbelief, if you are creeped out by the idea of what you're seeing, and it's convincing enough in that respect, then it doesn't have to be. I mean, this is not a medically realistic film necessarily, but it's a creepy one, and that sequence especially.
This film kind of does it both ways with that, where at the beginning of the film, there's a sequence where Christiane and the assistant it's a dialogue scene, and where we first get introduced to Christiane. And in that scene, they show the back of her head, and the assistant takes the mask off and puts it back on while they're talking. But you don't see her face at all in there, and you wonder, like, oh, are they going to do a Hitchcock thing and not really show her face?
Yeah.
But then they very much show it.
Yes, they do.
Later on in the film, which is an interesting about face. But I'm sorry. I'm a Catskills comic today. I can't help it.
I find it interesting that a lot of the film does not. I think one of the reasons there's confusion about how to classify it, or there was in '59, is that the film does not. There aren't a lot of scares in this movie.
Right. It's very atmospheric.
It is, and it's very. I think it's honestly more interested in. I mean, I honestly think that the Edith Scobb character, the young woman who's lost her face, it becomes this kind of sympathetic, almost this like Frankenstein character.
Yes,
or the monster,
yes.
Frankenstein's monster, rather, who is immediately a figure of sympathy, I think, for us.
Right. Right. And, you're talking about predecessors for medical horror. I do think Frankenstein is, a progenitor to this film, and just mad scientist movies in general. But I think an interesting line that you would draw, and again, I can't speak completely authoritatively on this, but it'd be interesting to see where this falls in the history of body horror, which I would argue is a little different from medical horror, because you have the mad scientist concept going back to silent films. But, here we're talking about the knife going into the face, that sort of visceral disgust.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, don't you think there's a little bit of like you could almost trace something like the Human Centipede back to this film?
Totally. Or David Cronenberg movies.
For sure.
Like Dead Ringers, for sure.
Yeah, totally. I was mainly impressed on it. I was impressed with its with the general atmosphere that the film has. He does a lot of smart things with off-screen sounds, for example. There's one of the things about the big manor that most of the film takes place at is that so the mad scientist, the mad doctor figure, he kind of practices on dogs. Mm-hmm. And so we get this not constant, but very persistent, the sound, this off-screen barking that's going on a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Like dialogue scenes, you'll have just in the distance, you'll have these dogs barking. And mm-hmm. It creates I think it really creates an interesting kind of unease that falls over the film. And there's just a lot of really, there's a lot of really small evocative touches. There's this great scene where the assistant character who we mentioned, I think they're disposing of a body or something, and a plane flies overhead. And mm-hmm. we just get a cutaway to the plane crossing the sky and her watching it. And it just conveys such a strong sense of this character's realization of where her life has gone.
Right.
They establish at a certain point that she is a former patient of the doctor's, and that she has essentially started working for him after he gave her a successful, mm-hmm. a face transplant, but he did some surgery on her that is completely seamless.
Reconstructive surgery. Yeah. Also totally. On her face. Yeah.
Yep. And she has just been kind of drafted into, we get the impression she's been doing this for a long time. And a moment like that, I mean, there's a fair amount of talking in this film, but there's also a fair number of scenes mm-hmm. like that one that express what's going on with these characters and the kind of sadness of, I think that is what really distinguishes this film for me from a lot of its apparent offspring, is that it is definitely more interested in the sadness of this operation than in the horror of it,
Yeah, and also, I mean, I first saw this film when I was in college, so about 15 years ago, mm-hmm. and the things that stuck with me, there were two things that really, I rewatched it for the show, but two things that really stuck with me over that 15 years is one, the dogs. Like the sound of the dogs barking really sticks in your mind. Yeah. But also this sort of lonely figure of Edith Scobb. She's wearing like this long, it almost looks like a lab coat, kind of a white smock. And she's, very like thin and frail girl with these big eyes behind this blank white mask. And there's a shot towards the end of the film where she kind of wanders around, dazed around the grounds of her house. That is just, it's really an indelible image, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. We should mention too that Edith Scobb later appeared in the film Holy Motors in 2012, and mm-hmm. that is one of many films that has, I think, some references to this film in it. That one's all about.
Yeah.
I mean, the main character in that, played by Denis Lavant, is often taking on new disguises and covering his face, and
yeah, but I think the most obvious one is The Skin I Live In, the Pedro Almodovar movie, which that's one of those ones where you said we were talking before the show, you're like, I knew it was an Eyes Without a Face reference, I just hadn't seen that one yet, so.
Totally. Yep. I guess in general I found this thing mostly to be kind of haunting. It never really except for the surgery scene, I was never terrified by it. But I don't hold any horror films to my particular. I will give extra points to something that genuinely scares me, but I don't mm-hmm. tend to deduct points from things that don't get under my skin, because horror movies are fundamental. Fear is fundamentally a subjective thing. You don't know what's going mm-hmm. to trigger you, when you're watching them. And the surgery sequence alone in this is, I think, upsetting enough to recommend, I guess I would say,
Yeah, and even the parts that are more, haunting or sad or poetic than they are like viscerally terrifying will still stick with you, I think.
For sure. Can we discuss one thing about the movie that I did find very funny, though?
Sure.
that I got a little hung up on. So this is the customary point in an episode where I'll say that I'm gonna discuss elements of the plot that happen later in the film. So if you don't want a spoiler for this movie from 1959, I don't know, skip ahead maybe 5 minutes or something.
That's a whole other episode of spoilers.
Yeah, exactly. But there is, so spoiler warning dispensed. There is late in the film, the police kind of start to suspect that something's going on with the doctor. They sort of they sort of are on, they're like on his tail at a certain point. So they coerce this young woman who has shoplifted into going undercover at his office and pretending to be sick, and seeing basically to see what happens. But then the police don't remotely follow through on that. They don't like follow her. No. They just let her get kidnapped. And like, what kind of operation are you guys running here? I mean, you literally planted her as an undercover, like she's there undercover, and you have the police are not paying any attention to like when they like come later and they're like, wait, was she released? It's like, you're supposed to be keeping track of that. This is your operation.
Yeah, they sent her out and they're like, job well done, everybody.
Yeah, pretty much. Like, you missed step 3 here. Yeah, this is definitely one of if you're in the mood to watch a movie that does not paint the cops very well, I think this is another one. They're kind of like I don't know what the intention was at the time, but they're kind of like gross idiots in this movie, I guess I would say.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about the other film. I have aired my dirty laundry. I've admitted that I've never seen this classic. So come at me with your pitchforks, you know.
A French classic, even.
I know. Ooh. Listen, I'm ashamed, but I've seen it now. So your pick for this, when I came to you, is The Omen.
Yes, a movie whose opening scene I've seen half a dozen times, but until this weekend, I had never sat and watched all the way through.
So had you kind of caught it on TV sometimes, or like seen some scenes?
Yeah. Or just there's one big scene in the film. It's towards the very beginning, so I don't consider this a spoiler alert. It's All For You, Damien, where the nanny jumps off the side of the house and hangs herself. I thought that was the climactic scene in the movie, which is interesting, but it's one of the beginning scenes in the movie.
Yeah, it's like the first scare, honestly.
It is.
Yeah. So The Omen is directed by Richard Donner, who I believe it's his fourth feature. He would go on to make the Superman and Lethal Weapon and Scrooged. So he, I think after The Omen, he became a very successful sort of Hollywood hitmaker.
Sort of a workman director, huh?
In some ways, yeah. I mean, I think he's and he's also he's one of the many people in the 80s who is Spielberg adjacent. He directed the Goonies as well, which is sort of a millennial touchstone. Side note about that, by the way.
Okay.
I hate the Goonies, and I hated it as a kid.
I don't like it either.
Not a good movie. Can our generation please get over this film? All right. We saw it as a kid.
Listen.
It's not a good piece of work.
You've got the Lost Boys. You've got the Monster Squad. I don't understand what the Goonies fuss is all about.
Exactly. You have so many better options, I would even go as far to say that The Sandlot is better than the Goonies. And the Sandlot is very much a Goonies-esque thing in some respects, I think, and particularly in its reputation among people our age. But
totally.
Let's normalize saying that the Goonies sucks. All right.
The Goonies hive is going to come after you.
Yeah, they are. But The Omen was sort of, I think, was really Donner's first giant hit, because this movie was a huge success. It's kind of thought of as the third point in the unholy triangle of Hollywood devil worshiper movies, one might say, or sort of Hollywood devil movies, I guess, of this time period. Yeah,
the return of Catholicism to the popular horror imagination.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the third in that trilogy, that unofficial trilogy. It came after Rosemary's Baby in the late 60s, and after The Exorcist in the early 70s. I would even venture to say that The Omen probably got made because of The Exorcist's success.
I would think so. I felt like this movie was kind of reaching to try to be The Exorcist in some places. And out of those three movies, this was my least favorite by quite a bit.
I think it's the weakest by like any stretch of the imagination, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean,
it was by far my least favorite of the three.
Yeah. I mean, when we were talking last week about elevated horror, we were talking about some of the movies that might have gotten tagged that in their own heyday, if the word existed back then. And we were talking about these studio movies that were these highly respected works of art that were also very much in the horror genre. And I think Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist are sort of two of the key examples of that, because
yeah, totally,
they are these really thoughtful films that are also really effective as horror movies. And The Omen, to my mind, is kind of although these are all Hollywood films, The Omen is the one that feels the most like a Hollywood film to me. It feels the most like a kind of a roller coaster ride, honestly.
Yeah, but a weirdly dramatically inert one.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do think there are some qualities I really like about this film, and we'll talk about those. I want to know, I want to know more about what you thought of this movie.
I really liked some of the scenes in the movie. I thought that a lot of the kill scenes were really cool.
Oh, it's a set piece machine, right? I mean, it's a set piece machine.
Yeah, it had some really cool set pieces in it. One that I had seen out of context, and then I saw it in the movie and was just like, oh, that's where that one came from. That's fun. The one, I guess, spoiler alert territory, once again, the one where a pane of glass comes off the back of a truck and decapitates the guy.
Great
and
sequence.
Yeah, I had seen that sequence before, but I didn't realize it was from The Omen, and so I kind of chuckled to myself a little bit when I watched the movie. But I found as a whole this movie to be like just a series of set pieces kind of strung together with kind of a lot of boring dialogue sequences. Like Gregory Peck plays little Damien's dad, and I found that a lot of the movie was just him discussing his child with other people rather than, because we don't see Damien on screen all that much. And honestly, this is going to sound harsh, and I don't mean it that harsh, but it reminded me a lot in its structure of a Lifetime movie where it's just a series of incidences strung together by a parent trying to figure out what's going on with their child. Only in a Lifetime movie, it would be the mom and not the dad.
Yeah.
But in structure, the sort of investigative structure of it was quite similar to what you'd see in a Lifetime movie. And in a Lifetime movie, it'd be called My Nanny is a Satanist.
See, I don't have that. I don't have that particular knowledge base, so this is interesting.
Yeah, like the structure of it just struck me as like really kind of formulaic in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you in some respects. I actually think that the structure of it really is a series of cool and mostly well-staged shocks. You know, I mean, there's like one after another. You could almost plot this thing by where, like, it's. I mean, they're not just kill scenes, but like where the scares are. That like every scare to me in this feels like a set piece in its own way.
Yeah, totally. Totally. It is. And that to me is a B movie thing, you know?
Yeah.
Because B movies and drive-in movies were structured that way on purpose, you know, because people weren't paying that close of attention for most of the movies. So there'd be a loud scare every once in a while to get them to look up.
Yeah. And I think that, I think it's effective in that respect. I think all the big scares in this, the scene you were talking about where the woman hangs herself is very creepy. But then you have a sequence like the one where Lee Remick, who plays the boy's, not the boy's mother, actually, as we learned in the opening scene. His adopted mother, where Damien knocks her off the second floor. She's like hanging from the railing of the second floor, that's a really sharply edited sequence. I think a lot of the scares in this are pretty sharply edited, and I think its reputation largely rests on that. I think the thing that people remember about The Omen, beyond its score by Jerry Goldsmith, which was actually won an Oscar. It's this pounding, bombastic score with Latin chanting in it. Highly
definitely
influential.
Heard that.
Oh, yeah.
I definitely heard that before. Yeah.
And you've heard a million ripoffs of it, too. I mean, like...
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. I would say if this movie has endured And I think it has endured, but I think one of the main reasons is that score, which we've heard so many variations on anything resembling satanic horror, you know?
Yeah, like how there was that whole series of movies in the 90s about the devil. You know, you had like The Devil's Advocate and End of Days. They definitely used the Omen type scores in those movies.
Yeah, for sure. And there's also, I mean, the Final Destination movies, I think, are direct descendants of the Omen, because one of the we should say what the plot of the film is for those who haven't seen it. Gregory Peck basically plays this American diplomat whose child dies in delivery, and he's so concerned that his wife is going to be devastated by this news that he agrees to adopt an orphan and just say it's their kid. Like, the movie is built on a foundation of a lie. And I'll say the one thing that I really do like about this film is that I do think that Peck works really well in this part, which you're right that a lot of the movie is him kind of just going and having expository conversations with people. There is a lot of exposition in this film. And he's not like the most exciting protagonist, but I think it's smart casting in the very least, because Peck is sort of associated with this kind of he's a very sensible presence. You know, I mean, he famously played Atticus Finch. So he comes across as this very reasonable, sensible, trustworthy man. You know, he is sort of the picture of somebody who's like, that's a sensible man. And
also he's a wealthy businessman, you know, which automatically grants you a certain amount of gravitas in American culture.
Well, for sure. But I think that his presence in the film allows us to accept something that horror movies often... I think horror movies often stumble over, which is, why don't these characters take this shit more seriously quicker? You know, because I think a lot of this movie is about Peck's character slowly coming to terms with the fact that, yeah, sorry, dude, your kid's the devil's son. And I think for us to buy that he very early on would not be like, yeah, that's what's going on. There's a bunch of crazy shit happening around my life, you know?
Right.
For us to see his denials as remotely sensible or sympathetic, I think a lot of that has to do with somebody like Peck being in the role, and just this certain quality that he brings automatically to the table. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. And another thing, again, spoiler territory, sorry. Another thing, you know, you're talking about that gradual realization. The realization that he comes to is pretty fucked up and was very transgressive in films at the time. Although I believe Assault on Precinct 13 came out before this one, which commits the ultimate taboo of killing a child on screen. What the conclusion he comes to is that he's going to have to kill this kid.
Yep.
And that's very dark and very taboo in movies. And I think that idea may have also bolstered this film reputation over the years, because I found it a little, you know, even coming from the jaded perspective of 2020, I was like, ooh, he's going to have to kill a 5-year-old. That's edgy shit.
Yeah. Well, and even to the very end, he is having trouble with that, you know, and I think on a whole, this movie is about denial. And I think it's about him denying the truth that's in front of him for as long as he can, because he just can't accept it. He can't accept that truth. But I think it's also about him denying the feelings of how his wife is feeling. It's about him living in a general state of denial. He's kind of moved his family to the UK. He's acting as the United States ambassador there. And I think he has this idea of what his life is. And I think it conflicts with sometimes with the way that his family feels, how his family feels, and what's actually going on with his family, you know?
I think that exact quality, though, makes this a less successful film than The Exorcist, because one of the things I like about The Exorcist is that for the first hour, it's very grounded in reality. And then midway through the film, there comes this moment, like this gigantic shift in the film, where the characters and the audience all accept that, yeah, this is really the devil, and we really have to fight the devil right now. And this movie never quite, it remains a little doubtful until the end, like you said. And I think that actually makes it a little bit weaker in terms of horror.
Do you think there's doubt? I mean, I think that the minute that maybe it's just decades of having. I mean, even if I hadn't seen this when I was a kid, I think that, you know, I mean, you know, you just saw this for the first time, but you know immediately when you see that fucking kid that he's evil. And they tell us very early on, like with the scene where the woman hangs herself, which is the first scene where the first scene of horrible, tragic violence in the film. He like makes eye contact with this Rottweiler that's running around that sort of,
yes,
you know, so we know, I mean, the movie is tipping us off immediately that this kid is that it's legit, you know?
I mean, it's more that Peck's character continues to have doubts until the end, and I think that it doesn't really allow it leaves that ambiguity and that sense of rationality in there, which prevents it from going fully into the realm of like the demonic and the unreal. I think.
Yeah, I think you're right that the structure of the film is very much like there's a big scary thing happens, and then there's minutes on end of dry conversation.
And also, I think that another, because I've seen the Exorcist half a dozen times. I really like that movie, and so I think it was a little inevitable that I would compare this to The Exorcist when I finally did watch it. And I think that the priest character in this one also, I think that Father Karras is a much better into the sort of Catholic God and the devil aspects of that story, because he is a more realistic, complex character. And in this one, the priest is a raving maniac from the beginning, and I think that further sort of delegitimizes the actual satanic threat.
Yeah, I mean, you have to give Gregory Peck's character a little more leeway, because the minute that this priest shows up to tell him what's going on, he is raving like a lunatic. He is not attempting to communicate with him. He basically is giving him a sermon, which Peck calls him out on. He's like, you have 5 minutes of my time. Please tell me what's so important. And he can barely get a word out of his mouth that's not just that's not just raving scripture, Yeah. I think you're right that in The Exorcist, part of the reason that works is that the holy men in that movie actually do seem like characters, and they're also men who have a little bit of dimension to them, as opposed to this guy who is just basically has 3 scenes in the film and is raving in every single one of them.
Yeah, and inherent to devil movies imply the existence of God, right? And so and the character representing God in the film is very undercut by that characterization, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that I personally I struggle a little bit with this particular subgenre of horror, not because I don't enjoy it, but just because I did not grow up with any religion in my house. I was raised in a entirely secular house. And so the concept of the devil is not as scary to me as I think it is for a lot of people. I think particularly Catholics,
People who are raised Catholic definitely have a special relationship with these 3 films in particular, I think. And I wasn't raised Catholic either. But I do find the idea of the fact that basically conservative values were being reinforced by these transgressive films, because like I said, ultimately, if there is a devil, there is a God. And so you should be a Christian because God is real and there's consequences. I find that really interesting just to look at and think about. And I really did feel like this film wasn't as strong in that way. And part of that is that the writer of The Exorcist, William Peter Blatty, was a devoted Catholic. And so there was real conviction behind what he was saying. He really believed it.
Yeah, I think this one is a little bit more mercenary and a little bit more trend chasing. I think that they basically were like, this is what's in the air right now. Let's make a solid set piece machine out of it. And ultimately, I do think it works in that way. It's a very fun film, in my opinion. The sequence we were discussing earlier, there's a decapitation scene. And,
it's oh my God.
It's such a good effect, and it's so fun. And it's Donner, the way he stages it, we see it from 3 different angles, and it lasts long enough that even if you were to look away, you can look back and it's still happening,
Yeah, and he knows that it's the money shot.
Oh,
you know what I
Big time.
Yeah. Like you said, there's 3 different angles on it. And I enjoyed all those scenes too. And I will say that I really enjoyed the kid that played Damien.
Yeah.
I loved him. He looked like a little baby angel cherub and a grown man at the same time. Just wonderful casting on that little kid.
Well, and he doesn't overplay. I mean, some evil kid movies really overplay the kids' sinister intentions, and they become these little proper malevolent adults in a way, where they're these little precocious monsters that are just a little bit too eloquent for a little kid, and you're just like, oh, that kid's evil. Look at him.
Right.
But I mean, Damien is just kind of, a lot of the time he's just acting. There's a very funny, I feel like there's a very funny, very small touch of dark comedy in the idea that Remmick's character is just kind of, that he is, in some ways, he's the devil's son, and that he's just a particularly difficult kid to deal with. You know?
Yeah.
He's just constantly getting on people's nerves and being loud and just being a kid, you know?
And just being, kind of a spoiled little brat.
Yeah.
You mentioned the dog up top. There's also a big black dog that protects him. And this turned out to be a dog double feature by accident because...
totally. Yeah.
Yeah, they factor into both of these movies.
They do. I didn't even think about that. That's great. So yeah, The Omen was a big success, and it spawned some sequels. The 3 of them, actually. I assume you haven't seen any of the sequels?
I've actually seen The Omen 2, but not The Omen. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I had to watch it for some reason. It was, you help with programming on something or something like that. It's in contention. Oh, it's set in Chicago. That's why I watched it.
Got it. Yeah, the sequels are fun.
It was totally fine to follow too, because all you had to know was Damien's the devil's kid and he's older now. Like, that's it. There wasn't really a whole lot to catch up on.
The third one is particularly nutty. In the third one, Damien is I guess this counts as a spoiler too. Damien is alive in the sequels, but in the third one, Damien is an adult played by Sam Neill, and the third one has.
Oh my God! Really?
Yes.
I love Sam Neill.
Oh yeah. It's worth watching. Seriously, if you enjoyed this at all, the third one is fun because the third one has some good set pieces, like almost every entry in this series, and it has an insane ending. I won't spoil the ending. I won't even hint at what the ending is, but the ending of the third one is insanely Catholic. One might say. So.
Oh man, I gotta watch that.
Yeah,
I love
for sure.
Sam Neill.
I haven't seen any of the TV show. I know that was not very well received.
Yeah, that came and went pretty quickly, I think.
Yeah.
I actually forgot it existed. So.
Yeah. But I think in general, the Omen is in some ways is as influential as The Exorcist on the genre. Mm-hmm. I think almost any evil kid movie that's come since has a little bit of its DNA in it. And I do think that musically, again, I mean, Jerry Goldsmith's score for this film, I think has really was extremely influential on the horror genre. Anytime you're hearing kind of ominous chanting in Latin, you're getting a little of The Omen.
Well, that's all we've got for you this week. We'll be doing Halloween episodes all month, as Dowd mentioned up top. But in the meantime, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to Film Club wherever you get your podcasts.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Rife. It was produced and edited by Carl Blumberg. Our sound mixer and finishing editor is Seth Hafer, and our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. Check back next week for a brand new episode. We're going to be talking about what scares us.
Bye.
Bye.
Woo.